So if you see this expression, Kiev and Russia, it means early Russia, okay? Because the center where the civilization started around 700s, 900s CE was what today we call the state of Ukraine, okay? That's the area. Okay, see, I purposely want to emphasize this, underline this area to let you know where, geographically speaking, everything started, which I repeat today creates a lot of political discontent in the debates between Russia proper and Ukraine, okay? And Poland also participates partially in this debate, okay, because as we learn at the very end of this class and next time, there were three major centers of so-called Russian civilization, okay? I also see 3 centers of Russian civilization, easy to remember, yeah? And 3 something else. And 3 foundational traditions that shaped early Russian civilization, okay? I don't know if Thompson, I didn't, I read twice the book which I assigned to you, but each time I forget things, so I didn't have time to look through these pages yesterday, okay? But I think he also makes this point. If he doesn't, so make sure that we remember these 3 things. First, there was a definite Scandinavian legacy, which served as an umbrella for the Kievan state, okay? Because it was so-called the Vikings, restless, warlike people who started building politically the Russian state, okay? There was also a Byzantine legacy that was injected, had been injected into this area, this circle, which I underlined a few moments ago. And Byzantine legacy primarily had penetrated this area through Greek Orthodox Church, or later it became known as Russian Orthodox Church, when Greek Orthodox Church became assimilated to the Russian soil. And today we're going to discuss this, okay? By the way, don't be confused by this word Byzantine legacy. So, what is the Byzantine? So just since you know history, basics of history, we have to pigeonhole, we have to locate this area, historical and geographical.
Basically, it's technically the eastern side of the Roman Empire after it was split into 2
Yeah, that's it. Just if you, I'm sure 99% of you know about this, but just in case if you forgot, for example, when I was a 3rd grade a college student in Russia, I didn't know about it. That is why I'm asking you about it. So I guess I measure everybody by my own standards, but I shouldn't think bad about other people. If I don't know something, it doesn't mean that other people don't know. But I didn't know about this. So later I was ashamed to find out that Byzantine Empire and Eastern Roman Empire, it's the same thing.
Actually, is that period where the Russian Orthodox Church came from?
Yes, that's what I'm talking right now. Okay.
I was just curious because
Absolutely correct.
While talking about Russia, it kind of makes sense that the Orthodox Church popped up around now.
Yeah. Byzantine tradition primarily was about Greek slash later became known Russian Orthodox Church. It came from here, from Byzantine. Okay. So when the Roman Empire had split in 2 parts, Western, the empire that had been eliminated by so-called barbarians, eastern part of the Roman Empire lingered on for 600 years, okay, and that's what is Byzantine, okay. And finally, so that was the earliest tradition, that was second. And after these two traditions, there was the third one that affected Russian civilization. It's Mongol Tatar invasion. Okay, in 1200s and 1200s, Genghis Khan and his Mongol troops invaded this area, conquered, and Russia, that unfortunately had been split in numerous feudal states, could not organize herself to resist Mongols, and she was, or better to say, the Russian states were conquered by Mongols, and Russian civilization was turned into tributary state. So for 300 years, Russia was influenced by the Mongols linguistically, physically, demographically, because Mongols and Russians, especially the eastern part of Russia, they became heavily mixed, and the Russian elite also became mixed with Mongol Khans. Okay, we will be talking about it. Okay, first let's start with the Vikings. Okay, the earliest tradition that laid the very foundation of Kievan state. Okay, between 700 and 900 CE. To the present day, the very origin of the Kievan state, or as they like to say in present day Russia, old Russia, ancient Russia, medieval Russia, because they don't want to put this adjective here. Okay? And so when I went to school, it was okay to use this adjective, because Ukraine was part of this big monstrous structure called Soviet Union. But right now they play it down. You know how people do. They always play these games, politically correct games. So anyway, the very origin of the Kievan Russia is the source of debates. And it started in the 1700s, when sparks of Russian nationalism were planted among the Russian elite. Okay. At that time, there was a debate between two groups of historians, European, primarily German-speaking historians, because Russian educational system had been established by Germans, invited by Peter the Great. They set up the Academy of Sciences. They set up schools, colleges, and Peter the Great and his successors invited a bunch of Germans from central Germany. Germany, if you remember, at that time was split into numerous states. And these educated people jump-started Russian science, educational system. Okay, and later, by the end of the 1700s, when the first Russian scholars emerged, scholars, writers, okay, intellectuals, they wanted to feel confident, of course. They were Russian speaking. So they started, they tried to argue that Russia was Russian from the very beginning. So Russian language was there, and the Russia was started in Russia, in Kiev, then Moscow, in these areas. Mm-hmm.
So I know that there's a Ukrainian language that's separate from the Russian language.
Mm-hmm.
Where did the Ukrainian language come from if these guys invented Russian?
It's called Church Slavonic. It's a good question you asked me. By 1900s, Greek Orthodox missionaries who came to finish conversion, to complete the conversion of Russia, they introduced written language. First books were scribed on parchment, and it became known Old Church Slavonic. Slavonic language with Cyrillic letters introduced by two Greek missionaries named by Methodius and Cyril. Cyrillic. Cyrillic alphabet, Cyril and Methodius. So they had introduced a Slavonic language. Primarily, the first educators were monks, church people. So that is why it became known as Church Slavonic. And there was no Ukrainian, Russian, or Belarusian language, of course. It was some type of ancient language. And right now, we can actually make a good judgment about this language because we have some old books that survive. Late in Middle Ages, they even created this phonetic system. So on YouTube, there are some scholars who tried to imitate how these people in Kiev and Russia had spoken at that time. Okay? At least they claim that's how ancient Slavonic people spoke. Okay? So what we call Ukrainian, Russian, Belarusian language, it's something that emerged at the turn of the 1900s. At first, there was a split between Ukrainian and Russian by the very end of the 19th century. And in 1910s, 1920s, there was a split between Russian and Belarusian, okay, when some of these peasants became residents of Poland. So they were split by the Bolshevik regime, and they developed their own dialect. And now, of course, being in independent countries, they already solidified the languages. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought you wanted to test something. Oh, okay. So the origin of Kiev and Russia was written down. Mythological origin of Kiev and Russia was written down in this document called Primary Chronicle. It's birch bark, pieces of birch bark that had been used to write this Church Slavonic language. Later, when parchment was introduced, it was put on parchments. So parchment could survive, but birch bark didn't survive. The only place where birch bark letters, chronicles survived, Novgorod. Novgorod, it's northwesternmost part of Russia, where they have swamps. And some of these pieces of bark that were dropped, pitched by local people, somehow preserved, and archaeologists were able to reconstruct some of the letters people had written to each other. It's amazing because wood normally doesn't survive, but I guess there was no air inside these layers of mud, okay, where these documents became preserved. So primarily, primary chronicle that had been put together by monks in 1113 is the document from which we know something in semi-mythological form about the origin of Russia. In this document, the monks, the Slavonic monks, they wrote that the first princes of Kiev and Russia were Vikings. That's what they wrote down, which created the which tainted all agendas and projects of late Russian nationalists, because they feel very uncomfortable about it. When your primary document had been tainted by this, what can you do about this? Okay, they have been trying to play it down, but there is no way to bypass it. And in fact, this document should be taken for granted because despite a bunch of mythological things that had been injected into this document, the basic message is correct because we can compare this claim of these monks that Vikings, or as they were called in Eastern Europe, Varangians. It's an Eastern European label for the Vikings, okay? Here we go. I'm sorry, I put it twice. Basically, to quote particular passage that mentions this invitation of Vikings to come to Russia, says literally the following: "There is no order in our lands. Please come and rule us," unquote, okay? And that's what these monks wrote. They said, Slavs could not organize themselves. They had to invite these people. And indeed, the first princes in Russia carried Scandinavian names. Okay, all these names: Rurik, Oleg, Asgard, Olga, princess. All these names came from Sweden, Norway. Okay, there's no way to bypass it. You again scratch your head. I want to test them.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. No, that's no big deal. No big deal. What is important to remember here, we can actually cast this story against what was going on in other parts of Europe at that time. You know history, right? Early Middle Ages. You know who Vikings were, right? Let me show you. Where is this map? Here we go. I will backtrack, so it's don't worry about it. If you know history of Vikings from early Middle Ages, you know that it was a group of restless people who dwelled in Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and suddenly between 700 and 900s, they literally spread around. They developed this culture warfare. There were some people in history that for many reasons they developed culture warfare, like in few thousands BC, there were so-called Aryan people, Aryans, Indo-Aryans who also expanded from Persia, Ukraine, to Europe, to India, Greece, everywhere. Okay. Because they developed this cultural warfare, conquered these areas. So at this point in the early Middle Ages, it was Vikings who developed this culture. And I guess the reason they developed this culture was simply because there was not enough fertile land in Sweden, Norway, especially Iceland. You couldn't plant anything. You could not even practice pastoral economy. Even horses were rare in these years. They did try to breed them, but there was not enough soil, not enough resources. So, and I guess what they became good at, they started to plunder neighboring people. You know, for example, that England, like even Russia, also was jump-started by William the Conqueror. Eh? Norman, they were called in France, Vikings were called Normans. Normandy, province Normandy was set up by the Vikings. Okay? So England was conquered by William the Conqueror, who was a Norman, a Viking, and later these Vikings became assimilated in the local society. They lost the trace of their Scandinavian roots. Okay, same basically, the same thing happened in Kievan Russia, when these Viking princes, they came, and most probably they conquered local people. See, it's hard to say, invited, of course. Most probably these chronicles were written at the order of these Viking princes, okay? But invited, yeah. But originally they probably had conquered these people.
Okay, this was my question.
Okay.
Yeah, it's exactly this point. I'm not aware, and I'm a neophyte in history, but I'm not aware of any other case in history where one ethnic group goes outside of itself and invites members of another ethnic group to come rule over them. Are there other examples of this?
No, I don't know really historically. There's some kings and queens that had been invited from outside. For example, English Parliament in 1688 invited William and Mary to rule over England. But again, they were not totally alien because Mary was the daughter of James II, if I remember. So she simply was married to Prince William of Orange because they were Protestant princes. They were in Netherlands. They were invited. Okay.
The only example I can think of is Normandy, which was also a Viking thing, and it wasn't necessarily like being invited to rule over. It was, I want to say Charles the Fat, but I don't remember because I get them all confused. Basically invited this Viking warlord to come and like, hey, here you have this land. Just please deal with the other Vikings for me. They're becoming a huge problem. So I think that's the only other example.
Interesting example. So basically, one Viking warlord was invited to
Yeah.
establish himself over the other Viking warlord. Okay.
And there's another one I can think of, when the Roman legion pulled out of Britain, right, the Britons were being terrorized by the Swedish Vikings. And they invited the Saxons to come in and be their protectors. And the Saxons took over.
Interesting. So what you, of course, it's a pure speculation right now. The same was about these speculations about origin of ancient Russia and our speculations. In fact, what you said to some extent could be true. Could it be possible, for instance, that one group of Slavic tribes wanted to use one group of Vikings against another group of Vikings? It was also possible, right? Like I'm using your case. Yeah? In this case, that might be the origin of this invitation.
Yeah,
Project, yeah?
I think the closer to the
It's like, if for instance it's a totally different example. If you study the history of mafia, U.S. during this Great Depression, dry war, when different groups of gangs fought each other, some business people invited one group of gangsters to protect them against the other group of gangsters. Yeah?
It also reminds me of people asking for U.S. aid in foreign countries, like foreign countries asking for America to come and help them, knowing our history of
Yeah,
giving aid to foreign powers.
yeah.
Usually
So-
doesn't end up well for them, and they'll keep inviting us to protect them.
So our historical minds concluded that we should not dismiss this theory of invitation. It could have been possible under certain circumstances. Okay, and by the way, yesterday I talked with one of my graded students. She's from Italy, and we kind of exchanged with her information. And this Viking talk came up, and I completely forgot about it. Sicily also had been conquered by the Vikings, and they set up here their own state. Okay, in southern France, the same thing. So basically, all over Europe, and don't forget about Greenland and Newfoundland. There's recently a feature movie was made about invasion of Vikings. I forgot on HBO. How Vikings invaded Newfoundland and set up here settlements, started to trade with local Indians or Native Americans, I'm sorry. And Greenland the same. Okay, so basically the story which was recorded in the primary chronicle, basically it was correct about the Vikings coming there and setting up their rule. Okay, so at least in this case we know it's true. Okay, let me backtrack because I need to, jeez, what is this? Okay. Okay, the chronicle says that the first leader who was invited to rule was Rurik. He ruled in Novgorod. Rurik, a typical Scandinavian name. But from Byzantine chronicle, we know that before Rurik, there were some other Viking warlords who came to trade in Constantinople. So it means they had been already Vikings in different parts of Slavic lands. Okay. So which means that, of course, in this case, it was an invented story, most probably because Rurik set up his dynasty, and the same chronicle says that he actually conquered all these areas, introduced his rule, and maybe he ordered this chronicle to be written, okay, to commemorate his rule, okay, since he was the warlord who had conquered these areas, okay, and others were losers, he was the winner, and winners write history, as you know. To the present day, I repeat, there is a debate in Russian history scholarship. Some patriotic or nationalist Russian historians argue it's not true. Slavic people had created their own statehood. They had their own civilization. and they curse so-called Norman theory. It's called in Russian history scholarship. It's in Russian nationalist scholarship. This theory about the Viking origin of Kievan Russia is called Norman theory. Okay, Norman theory. Is it here? I don't see it here. So Norman. And of course, it's dismissed by patriotic historians, academic historians who rely on archaeology, primary sources, who are not engaged politically. They tend to accept this so-called Norman theory. So, but the debate is still going on because no matter how many facts, evidence you provide, history will be always politicized. You know this from present debates in the United States. The left, the right, they have their own agenda. They promote their own history. No matter what kind of facts, each side will be pulling out its own facts, arguing that we are right, you are wrong. You know? Okay. So sometime, if we have time, sometime we might talk about this. But now we are more interested in this. In each country, history is politicized. You go to what? France, Turkey, Armenia, Ukraine, present-day Ukraine. There is no country without politicized history. Okay. When I was writing my book on socialism, one of the chapters was about Tanzania, African country, so I had to read a lot about Tanzania, and as soon as I plunged myself, oh my God, there's also a bunch of debates and people curse each other, ready to attack each other. You know? So it's not only our domain, you know. The reason other people react to what we debate here is simply because U.S. the number one country in the world, and everybody looks up to us, you know. Whatever happens here reverberates all over the world, you know. So far, U.S. like Byzantine Empire used to be, it's very powerful, you know. I don't know for how long, but so far it's still powerful. Okay. Okay. So there is a bunch of archaeological evidence, coins, paraphernalia that comes from Scandinavia. I had a graduate student who wrote a thesis with me a few years ago. He actually wrote in his thesis about the trade between Arabic countries and Scandinavia. So master thesis, he basically gathered a bunch of whatever other historians wrote and put together some kind of historiography, what other people wrote on this issue, and a lot of evidence, interesting work, you know. So the student, he didn't discover anything new. He simply brought together what other historians wrote. It was interesting to see that how much evidence people collected. There was a trade. Vikings sailed to Constantinople, to Arabic lands, traded. There was a bunch of Arabic coins found in Scandinavia proper, Sweden, Norway, and Russia, of course. Okay, Byzantine coins. And a reason why Kievan Russia was set up, because the city of Kiev, it was started as a trading post, was conveniently located, okay, as the stopover, where people could stop, these Vikings, gather their goodies, replenish their supplies, and move on to Byzantine to trade. Okay. If you don't have time, of course, to read the primary chronicle, you can find it in English. It was translated on Google, but it's time-consuming. You don't need to do it. But if you want, you can do it, of course. But if you want to have fun and at the same time learn about the origin of Kievan Russia, I recommend you to read this book by Michael Crichton. You heard about this writer? He used to be famous in the 1970s. Do you remember Michael Crichton? No? You know?
Yeah.
See, you know.
Not that I'm not.
You're not familiar with this, yeah? I happen to know this name for a long time. He was an author, famous 1970s and 1980s. He wrote a bunch of action stories, novels. One of them is Eaters of the Dead. So he picked up a diary of Arabic traveler who went to the eastern part of Kievan, Russia, okay, in the year of 1000, something 1000, the end of 900s, 1000, and traveled among these Vikings. He joined them, okay. It's a real chronicle, a real diary, Ibn Fadlan, okay. Ibn Fadlan. Is it here? Not here. So Michael Crichton used it and he fictionalized this diary, paper that was stories, action stories, integrated. Beowulf, you know Beowulf, it's ancient story that was reinvented in Middle Ages and became like one of the most famous pieces of literature, ancient Scandinavian literature. Okay, so he mixed these stories together and wrote this book, and then they made a movie about it. So you can go on YouTube and watch this movie. But movie makers thought it was too gross, you know, to label movie. I guess now it could have happened, you know, but at that time, 1970s, they didn't want to use this title, so they called it The 13th Warrior, okay? So you can watch it, it's an action-packed movie, okay? Antonio Banderas, I think, played the major character, okay? This traveler, Arabic, Ibn Fadlan, okay? And interesting description, and then a movie, this footage of funeral of a Viking prince in Russia, how he was burned with all his goods, with his wives. It was a tradition, so this cruel tradition was practiced by the Vikings, you know, to show off their love. Wives had to die with their husband, okay. Of course, polygamy was practiced, you know. Okay. We also have some interesting documents which survived from Scandinavia called sagas. You heard about sagas, yeah? Sagas.
Sagas.
Sagas. What can you explain to us what it means?
No, I can spell it.
Okay.
Right, sagas are like Homer. They're like Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. They are oral stories that are repeated by bards, usually in noble halls, where they tell the tales of these heroic figures from the past.
Mm-hmm. Everything is correct except one thing. Sagas are more authentic than these mythological stories because these stories were written on stones, and stones survived. And what they did, they described the lives of particular clans, Viking clans, from ancient times to early Middle Ages to the original Christianity. Okay, so in this case, they are more authentic. So some Vikings in late Middle Ages, or ancestors of Vikings, people who lived in Sweden, they actually could trace their clans back to 900, 1000 when these sagas were written. Of course, a bunch of invented stories were included there. But basically the stories about their pursuits, how they went to North America, how they went to Sicily, how they went to Russia, they were recorded, okay? So that's one of the solid evidences we have, okay? These runes, Scandinavian runes written on stones. Of course, later it was put on paper in the 1700s, 1600s, 1700s. But originally it was written on stones, these runes, runic letters in Iceland and Norway. So pretty solid source. And that's how we know about, for example, travels of the Vikings to Labrador, to Newfoundland. That's how we know about Rurik, the name was mentioned there. That's how we know that they traveled to northwestern Russia. Okay. What actually happened, Slavic people who had been conquered by the Vikings, they eventually assimilated these warlords and their warriors, and that was it. So they picked up Slavic wives, and eventually, indigenous tradition primarily is transmitted through women because they had raised children, okay, at that time. So that is why Vikings lost the traits of their culture. Okay, even names already in 1200s, we hardly can find any Scandinavian names. in Kiev and Russia, it was primarily Slavic names. Okay. All right. It's just I found this useful for us to read. Sorry that I included this big passage for you. Just kind of summary of what we've talked about right now. Okay. The major trade items which Vikings carried to Constantinople and to Arabic lands were furs. And by the way, furs, as I told you last time, later, by the 1600s, became the major trade item in Russia, the major export item. Okay. So it had been jump-started by the Vikings, who gathered the furs, who collected the tribute in furs from local tribes. Okay. Wax and honey. Sugar was very precious. That is why honey was used instead of sugar. It was very, very valuable. Alcohol was made, so-called mead. There was, maybe you heard. It's a type of beer made by the Vikings. M-E-A-T, mead, made of honey. By the historians speculate that by the time of Rurik, what is 800s plus something, we already have a few Viking warlords in what today we call Russia. So Rurik himself was in Novgorod, it's northwestern Russia. In Kiev was his relative Askol, again, Scandinavian, die-hard Scandinavian name. Deer, two brothers ruled in Kiev. Rogvold, another die-hard Scandinavian name, Swedish name, ruled in Polotsk. Polotsk, it's central Russia. Okay. Tur, again, another Scandinavian name, is a city named Turov. To the present day, this city exists. Turov. They added Slavic ending, became Turov. And eventually, historians suggest that this guy, Rurik, defeated his relatives, subdued them, killed. Actually, primary chronicle tells us that he supposedly killed Askol and Deer, seized Kiev, and that's how Kiev and Russia emerged under Rurik. So he established a dynasty. Okay. I just mentioned this. Okay, this stuff I just mentioned, that both groups, Slavic and Vikings, became assimilated, and the name for this group of people who mixed with each other became known as Ros or Rus. Originally, that's how Vikings had been referred. So those Vikings who had conquered eastern lands, Eastern Europe, they had been referred in early medieval sources. Byzantine, Mecklenburg Chronicle, I mentioned it before. I wrote it down, but didn't say it. Mecklenburg Chronicle, an ancient German chronicle, they mentioned people of Ros or Rus. So that's a reference to these Vikings. But later, this mixture of Slavic people and Vikings became known as Rus or Russia. Okay. Some crazy nationalist recently, he died, became very popular. He tried to trace the origin of Rus or Ros to ancient Egyptian word Ra. He said that's a sun god, so we came from Egyptians, the most ancient civilization. Very popular guy. Delivered lectures, and you know how it is. Yeah? As I said, each civilization wants to prove that they were the first to invent steam engine, airplanes, and everything, space ships and everything. And they were the most ancient that had created the most ancient civilization and things like that. Okay. So I mentioned that Rurik had probably conquered all these warlords, established himself in Kiev, and his son, Oleg, another Scandinavian name, transferred the capital of his domain to Kiev. Okay, it was what? 1880s, 1890s. Okay. Let's move on. All right, so according to archaeologists, I copied this map last year when I was tinkering with this PowerPoint. One archaeologist created this map that was reprinted in Encyclopedia Britannica, and that's how they trace this Kievan state, the borders of the Kievan state. The state had to confront nomads that were coming from this area: Bulgars, Kipchaks, Khazars. Khazars were an interesting group of people who accepted Judaism. It was a group of nomads who practiced Judaism. Okay. Bulgars were pagans, Kipchaks were pagans, others. So Oleg had to fight them. Okay. And a bunch of later stories, early medieval Russian stories, later chronicles that followed primary chronicle, 1200s, 1300s. They're filled with stories about fight against Eastern nomads. Okay. Uh-huh.
I don't know if it's her or it's another woman. Wasn't her husband like murdered by somebody? So
Mhm.
as revenge, she like basically took over
Mhm.
like their country. Okay.
Yeah, that's her.
Okay.
Yeah, that's her. So this guy, Oleg, see a bunch of names. He had a son, Iger, another Scandinavian name. He was married to Olga, okay. This lady, nobody knows, her name is Scandinavian, but probably she was Slavic, because they took as wives Slavic women, but maybe she was a Scandinavian, nobody knows. So anyway, Iger was a very nasty guy. He he tried to gather as much tribute as possible. Okay, he literally sucked dry all these Slavic people. So on one occasion, it was written in Chronicle, he collected tribute in a particular area. Again, I don't want to bring more names, we will forget them anyway. So he gathered tribute in one place, and then his team, which helped him to gather tribute, became upset that they didn't get enough furs, honey, wax, whatever they collected from these peasants people. So he came back to gather to extract another tribute. And that's when these people, local people, killed him. Okay. In revenge, Olga, who took over this Kievan state, okay. See, among the Vikings at that time, they didn't have this Western European tradition. In West Europe, in the early Middle Ages, there was a tradition it should be a male only to serve as a warlord, king, okay. But Vikings, they didn't have this tradition. So if you read about Vikings, you know that in places where they lived, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, they didn't make this difference. So women, men could be leaders, okay. So in this particular case, she took over, and in a Viking way, she inflicted the huge destruction on this particular area, which the story that became written, as you correctly mentioned. So she literally burned the whole area, destroyed, and of course everybody was petrified. Eh?
Destroyed ships, like their economy, destroyed their killed all
Yeah,
their
yeah. Mm-hmm. In a cunning way. So she pretended that she wanted to make a peace, but screwed than the local people. Okay, so basically she was on the wrong side in this case. But later, I think she realized that the intimidation was not the only tool to unite people. You can intimidate people, but you cannot do it forever. What she does, that's an interesting transition we are making right now. So she travels to Byzantine, and in Byzantine she converts to Christianity. Okay, and again, it's a speculation, pure speculation on my part, on the part of other historians and archaeologists. They suggest that she used Christianity as the glue. One God, one princess. Get together, guys and girls, okay? And in fact, you can see the same story if you compare Kievan Russia with what was going on in Europe, for example. 500 CE, I think, 500 CE. In France, there was a kingdom of Franks, right? And the Clovis, the warlord, he converted to Christianity in order to bring his state together. Pure political decision. Even if you go back further to Constantine, Roman emperor, in 313. Thank you. 313. CE, right? CE? Okay. Constantine, he presided over crumbling Roman Empire. How to glue it together? Okay, pagan empire had many gods, you know. So, according to this legendary story, he was fighting barbarians, and he took an oath if Christian spirit, Christian medicine would help him to win over barbarians, he would convert to Christianity. So in this particular battle in 313, he did win over the barbarians, and he converted to Christianity. And then his successor, Theodosius, made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Is that correct?
Well, the date's correct, but he was actually fighting Maxentius, who was, he was Caesar. His father was the Caesar in Britain. And he went to Rome, and he fought Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. So he wasn't fighting barbarians.
Oh, okay.
He was fighting another Roman army. And the story is that he saw in this sign, you will conquer, and he had all of his soldiers put the cross on their shields.
But he pledged that he made this oath, yeah? He took an oath too.
Right. So, but it wasn't barbarians. It was
Okay, good. Thank you. So that's a correct story, because again, my knowledge of ancient history in this case, not perfect, and I appreciate your comment, you know, that's how it goes. But in fact, it's good that you made this correction, because it proves that, again, Roman Empire was crumbling, that he was not fighting barbarians, he was fighting basically one of his own, yeah? In this case, okay? And but I insist on this, that Christianity was used as an attempt to solidify empire spiritually, okay? So, and I suggest that in this case we deal with the same story, okay? In case of Olga. So she was,
Is there any support for the idea that she was inspired by what Constantine had done?
Oh, no. I'm sure she didn't know about him.
That's what we
No.
Yeah, okay.
So she was baptized in Byzantine, and chronicles, Russian chronicles, of course, praise her, how beautiful she was, how clever she was, that he deceived the Byzantine emperor somehow, and a bunch of stories, okay? A few words about Christianity, if you forgot, okay? I'm a historian of religion, so let me kind of step in this case. I don't miss this. Don't want to miss this opportunity. I simply want to understand the place of Russian Orthodox Christianity in this global scheme that what was going on at that time. Okay, so if you forgot, you please remember that Christianity at that time, 700s, 900s, was represented by Roman Catholic Church. Okay. So all Christians were Roman Catholic at that time, because Roman popes were considered like the heads of this church. But at the same time, in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, from the very beginning, we see so-called patriarchs. It's local archbishops challenging the Roman popes. Okay, and since western part was based on the Roman law, Latin language, and the eastern part was based on what? On Greek language, on the Greek tradition. Two powerful traditions. Okay, and they became split. You know, Greeks and Romans were the foundation of the Roman Empire, but when empire was divided in two parts, these traditions, they became split. And the Greeks had their own alphabet. Romans in the western part had their own Latin alphabet, and that's how they went separate ways. Okay, you will see it here, exact year. In 1000 plus something, these two parts became split. They had been split already by late Roman emperors because it was hard to rule this empire. The empire started to collapse. But spiritually, they also split, and that's how we have Eastern and Western Christianity.
Yeah, it was, I think, 1054, where it was like,
1054.
It was like still ostensibly two branches of the same faith, but they've been sort of pulling and tugging at each other for a couple hundred years. And then eventually the Pope, who's the head of the Roman Catholic Church today, and the Patriarch of Constantinople excommunicated each other. At the same
Absolutely
time,
correct.
And that created some irreconcilable differences.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. In fact, Eastern Roman emperors, Byzantine emperors, they didn't want to be obedient to the Roman Pope. Okay, that is why they supported Byzantine archbishops who challenged the Roman Pope. Okay, so there was a bunch of political intrigues here. Okay, so after 1054, we have a Roman Catholic Church and Greek Orthodox Church. That became the name of this church. Okay, and that's when Olga converted to Christianity. Of course, it was Greek Orthodox Church because Greek monks, Greek priests were considered the experts. Okay, they presided over this religion. They handled this alphabet. They were missionaries. But later, in later centuries, when Greek Orthodox Church started to drift to Russia, Kievan Russia, further and further, especially when Ottoman Turks, you heard about Ottoman Turks or Seljuk Turks, these militant Muslims, new kids on the block, because Turks, they were new converts to Islam. In fact, they hated Arabs. They told Arabs, some Arab princes, you are not pure Muslims. You don't defend Muslim faith, You have to be tough. And of course, as new kids on the block, they wanted to show off that they're diehard Muslims, 12 and 1300s. These Turks, new converts to Islam, they started to push against Byzantine, and eventually they destroyed Byzantine. And finally, in 1457, as far as I remember, you will correct.
1453.
Good. See, it's hard to remember all the dates. Sometimes I practice it, proud of myself sometimes, but many times I make mistakes. 1453, Turks finally conquered what remained from the Byzantine Empire. You know what remained by this date from Byzantine Empire? Only one city called Constantinople. Okay, Turks squashed it, destroyed where the central Christian cathedral was located. That's called, I think, Saint Sophia Cathedral. Erased it, and on this foundation, I think they built Istanbul Mosque. That's how the city became known, Constantinople.
They didn't destroy it.
They didn't.
No, it's still there.
Another correction. Okay, go ahead.
No, it's called
But something happened with it. What happened?
So it's Hagia Sophia. It's when you pull into the harbor. You see it. It's spectacular.
Mm-hmm.
But it's built with 5 domes. It was built by Justinian
Mm-hmm.
in the 500s.
But what did they do?
They
Did they build a mosque nearby or what?
they built another mosque there, but they converted the church into a mosque.
See? I wasn't totally wrong.
And the
Okay.
president of Turkey,
Uh-huh.
it was then Ataturk made it a national museum.
Okay. Mhm.
And what's his name? The president of Turkey, Erdogan?
Erdogan.
Erdogan
Uh-huh.
has now made it a mosque again.
Again. Here we go again. Okay, good. I appreciate your comments. So, they did convert it to mosque. So let's emphasize. Then it was allowed to become a church. Now it became
Going to a museum.
museum. Oh, museum. See, another interesting point. Okay, I still defend. I have to defend Western civilization. But anyway, I appreciate your comment because it shows how complicated it was. Yeah? So the church was not erased but shut down and converted into mosque. Okay, to make a long story short. Anyway, but why do we need this story? And I want you to remember this story. We are talking about the end of Eastern Christianity in this place, right? That had been conquered by the Turks. So what this Greek Orthodox Church started doing, they started to move away where? To Greece. But Greece also was conquered later by Turks. Is it correct? It's correct. Okay. So where could they escape? They started to move to the north, to Kiev, to Russia, and that's where all these people finally found a safe space. Let me put it this way, okay? And that's how eventually this church became known as Russian Orthodox. Okay, that's the story. Okay? And to jump ahead, just for your information, you know that in Western Europe, in 1517, Martin Luther revolted against the popes, these notorious popes who wanted to subjugate everybody. And they jump-started so-called Protestant movement, heavily decentralized movement that was focused on the Bible. Okay, they kicked out agents of Pope from Northern Europe, and that's how Northern Europe became Protestant, Southern Europe remained Catholic. So that's the story of Christianity in 5 minutes. Okay. All right. So we mentioned this. We don't need it. Okay. Oh, here you go. That's the same year. Okay. Just to add to your story, which you told us, correct year you gave us, that Pope Leo IX and Patriarch, it's Archbishop in Eastern Byzantine Empire, they actually excommunicated each other. See, people, in fact, I will tell you more, I forgot about it. When I taught this class, History of Religion, Kenny took it with me, right, History of Religion, 5 or 6 years ago, a long time ago. So we did discuss this stuff in detail. And now it comes back. Both Archbishop or Patriarch of Byzantine and Pope Leo, they called each other Satan. And they said, you are not true Christian. And another said, you are not true Christian. So which tells us a lot about religion. Yeah? People love to say that I'm a true believer, you are not. You know, to the present day we still have conflicts, you know. In Afghanistan, for example, yesterday I read this, two groups of Muslims, this Taliban tells Khazarians in central Afghanistan, you're Shiites, you're not true Christians. Shiites said, no, Taliban, you're not true Christians. So civil war is coming, guys and girls. So it's a long story. You know? In all religions, we have this fight. Okay. People were killing each other, by the way. We forgot to mention, we don't have time to mention it because it doesn't fit our story about medieval Russia. But you know that during Crusades, Crusaders who supposedly came to Constantinople before Constantinople was destroyed by Turks, they ransacked Constantinople, plundered it. So Western Christians attacked Eastern Christians, raped, killed them, plundered the city, okay, before Turks destroyed it completely. So there are economic reasons, of course, why people argue about religion, not only spiritual reasons. Of course, there are spiritual reasons first, but there are also economic reasons. All right, something for you to know a few things about Russian or Greek Orthodox Church or Eastern Orthodox Church. If you look at the Roman Western Church, you will see these spills, sharp spills, Gothic structure. A typical Russian or Greek Orthodox Church, it's an onion dome, okay? That's how you recognize it, just for you to remember. And also, that's another important difference. That's what they were fighting about, because Roman Pope said, you are heathens, Eastern Christians. Eastern Christians said to the Roman Pope, no, you are heathen, you are heathen. They had different crosses. In Western Christianity, there is this type of cross. To the present day, if you're here, in Western Christianity, you have this cross. But in Greek Orthodox Church, Russian Orthodox Church, it's not correct cross. This is the correct cross. Why? Because this cross is legitimized by this argument that it goes back to the crucifixion. Because both hands and legs of Jesus were nailed. Okay, so where are the legs of Jesus? So you are not authentic Christians, okay? We are authentic. Okay, so if you cherish this cross, I will be fighting with you. Okay. Plus, again, they denounced each other over these things. Again, I don't want to offend anybody. Again, I respect all religions because I am teach history of religions, okay? If you're Catholic, I suppose nobody here is an Orthodox. But in case you're Catholic, again, I don't want to offend anybody. But they argued about these tokens. In Catholic religion, you know, saints are very important, right? Statues of saints, you kneel down in front of Mary, you ask for something, yeah? In front of... I don't want to be blasphemous, I'm sorry. Am I? You're giving me this look.
No, this is hilarious.
Huh? What's that?
This is hilarious.
Oh, okay. So Eastern Orthodox Christians, they said, oh, you are pagans because you worship these idols. And logically speaking, they were correct. Okay? Because, in Western Christianity, they kind of worship these statues of St. Nicholas, St. Mary, statues, you know, how could you do it? But at the same time, Western Christians told these guys in the East, they said, you are pagans too. Because in Eastern Christianity, they worship these icons, images of saints, okay? So the Eastern Christians kneel down in front of these wooden images of saints, icons, wooden plates, and also ask for forgiveness or something, you know, whatever it could be. So so-called icons are sacred objects in Eastern Christianity. Okay. And that's how written language was introduced. We talked about this a little bit before in Kievan Russia. Okay. Cyril and Methodius introduced this. Okay, they traveled to Bohemia, or present-day Czech Republic, then further to Ukraine, Kievan Russia, taught local monks how to read and to write, and that's how they jump-started written language. Old Church Slavonic, I mentioned this already. Her, Olga's son, named Vladimir, a very important name. I want you to remember this name because this prince, again, warlike prince, Vladimir, again, Viking name in this case, he actually, like the king of Franks, Clovis, issued an order that all people who lived in Kievan Russia, they had to be baptized. See, Olga, she didn't do it. So she encouraged people to convert to Christianity, but she did not impose it. So she kind of gently pushed people. But he already accepted baptism in 988. It's roughly the correct date. And that's considered the birthday of Russian Christianity. 988 in Chersonesus. It's an old Greek town. You know, Greeks, ancient Greeks, they set up Greek states all over Mediterranean Sea, on Black Sea. So one of these old city-states that had been inherited by Romans and then by the Byzantine Empire. revolted against Byzantine emperors. Okay, and the local commander who didn't want to obey the orders issued by the Roman emperors, he revolted, and Roman emperors asked Vladimir and his warriors come and help them to subdue this revolt in Chersonesus, Crimean Peninsula. So in exchange, he said, I want you to give your sister. See, Eastern Roman Empire was ruled at this point by two emperors, two brothers. And they had a sister, Anne, her name is what, Anne or Anne. And he said, I want her for my wife. And they said, okay, we will give you her as your wife, but in exchange, you have to convert to Christianity. Okay? And that's how things happen.
Behind you.
It was recorded in Byzantine Chronicles that he subdued this revolt in Crimea. They brought this princess. Vladimir converted to Christianity, was plunged by these local monks in the water, adopted Christianity, and married Anna or Anne. A bunch of stories had been invented around this. Supposedly he was losing his eyesight. As soon as he converted, he saw the light. Most probably it's a metaphor. You know how religious people, they argue when you convert, you see the light, yeah? So that's the argument here. Okay. Sure.
This isn't Vlad the Impaler, or is it Peter Partisan?
I'm sorry?
This isn't Vlad the Impaler?
Yes.
That's him.
Oh, no. You mixed two stories. The Vlad the Impaler, it's Romanian prince, from Romania.
Okay.
About 500 years in the future from this.
Who gave rise to this Dracula mythology, right? Totally different story.
So would his name mean sword of peace? Would his name be sword of peace? You said Mir meant peace.
Mir means peace, yeah. Vlad the peace, yeah. Vlad the peace. That's how it should be rendered, okay. At the same time, another chronicle says that he actually was converted when he came back to Kiev. So there's two stories. And right now, of course, I keep talking about politicization of history. Today, Ukraine insists that the later chronicle that says that Vladimir converted to Christianity in Kiev, that's the correct story. But Muscovites, Putin's regime today insists that this story is correct. Because they seized the Crimea. You know, Russia took over Crimea in 2014. One of the reasons why they took over, because Russian regime, and rightly so, believed that Crimea could be used as a symbol of nationalism. Okay? Since according to the legend, one of the two legends, Vladimir had adopted Christianity in Crimea. Since Catherine the Great, we will learn about it later, Catherine the Great, one of the Russian Empress Tsarina, she had conquered the Crimea, kicked out Turks from there, and it was like a victory of Russian weapons, guns, it was celebrated at her time. So the present day Putin's regime calculated well, indeed, a siege of Crimea became a unification factor, almost 80% in 2014. 80% of Russians approved this, okay? So, to the present day, the symbolism of Crimea is used to bring national unity, and this story about Vladimir, who converted to Christianity, the year is considered the sacred date in present-day Russia. It's celebrated, each year it's celebrated. 28th of July, I think, 23rd or 28th of July, that's supposedly when he did it in Crimea, is widely celebrated in Russia, in Moscow. Okay. But Kiev, of course, celebrates another story. And in fact, in Kiev, they built a monument to Vladimir. To challenge this monument, big monument made of granite, in Moscow, Putin ordered to install Russian Vladimir. So there's another monument. So the two monuments, big monuments, a Russian monument to Vladimir is bigger in size, than a Ukrainian monument. So that's another competition of architecture. Putin himself traveled to Crimea after Crimea was seized, and he dived, and it was televised. He dived, and supposedly he brought from the bottom of this area, lagoon and Crimean Peninsula, ancient Greek amphora. It's a clay vessel. Greeks used these clay amphoras, clay vessels, to carry wine and all kind of goodies. So he pulled out this, and then he approached the Russian Orthodox Church. A lot of symbolism. So to emphasize that first we're Russian Orthodox, at the same time, look at this Greek amphora. We trace our origin to Greeks. As it turned out, local archaeologists prepared this chunk of clay, ancient clay, so he dived to pull it up, for TV cameras. Everything is a story. Okay? Everything is a story. Everything is for the sake of publicity, for the state publicity. All right, let me check the time. Yeah, we still have a few minutes. A few words about the Russian Orthodox Church, just to give you an idea, basic idea. In the Russian Orthodox Church, emphasis is placed on collective salvation, collective spirit. Okay, stress on the group, and it goes back to the peasant commune. Remember, peasants lived by mir, M-I-R, by collective. Vikings were very collective people. They were fighting together. There's team spirit. Again, read Ibn Fadlan or read Michael Crichton, where he describes how they collectively acted as bands of Vikings, helping each other. It's reflected in the Russian word sabornost. Sabornost means spirit of congregation, literal translation. Sabornost means spirit of congregation. And of course, out of church, it traveled to secular life, became this foundational stone for the Russian tradition. And a lot of stress, like in the Catholic Church, by the way, like in the Catholic Church, the emphasis in Russian Orthodox Church is placed on outward forms of religion. It means church singing, vestments, okay, icons, which, for example, you don't have if you're members of the Protestant Church. We're just the opposite. Everything is bare walls with one cross and Bible in the hands. Okay, see, the Russian Orthodox Church is totally different. Mosaics, decorations, singing, incense. There's holy smoke, everything. That is why it's not related to what we're talking about right now. But to some extent, it may be related. That is why Russian Orthodox missionaries became so successful in Siberia or in North America among Native Americans, because all these attributes, they reminded native people shamanism, the indigenous religion. Unlike Protestant missionaries who had the book, and the people who couldn't read, Native Americans, who existed in pre-literal culture, how could they communicate with missionaries? Okay, asceticism, monastic life. A few samples of Russian alphabet that eventually developed out of Church Slavonic in a simplified form. Okay. Everything, it's just for your information to summarize what we already emphasized here. Okay, the difference between Eastern Christianity that had been adopted by Russians and Western Christianity, Roman Catholic Church. Okay. Onion domes. Okay, everything is icons. In fact, icon making that was introduced in Byzantine declined when Turks conquered Constantinople. So the art of icon making traveled to Russia, and the Russians perfected it and became like a symbol of the Russian art. When you hear about Russian art, the first thing that comes to our mind is the icon. Okay, and it's true. It's correct. So these objects in each peasant family, later by the 1600s, each peasant family tried to have this icon in the corner. When people enter a door on the opposite side, there should be icon. And the tradition is that when anybody comes, especially a traveler who comes from unknown lands or relatives who didn't visit this house, this person should kneel down and pray to this icon. Okay.